Martha Nelson gave me a perfect introduction to this, because she came and said, you know, I've been looking for your books everywhere, and I can't really find them. And that's because I think, without a doubt, I'm Dummerston's most prolific, virtually unpublished writer. I think so. I'm not sure, but I'll tell you how I got there. I currently have, I'd say, 8 or 9 books, depending on how you're counting, in some phase of being written. I have 2 agents, I have 1 contract, and I got about 4 proposals out. So I'm going to try in 10 minutes to tell you how that happens. Strange state of affairs. I published my first book, of course, when I was 7 years old. It was a memoir of a trip to New York City, and my mother always saved it because she figured someday, you know, I'd be famous to be worth something. So you never. I tried to find it before now, it's somewhere in the house. Fast forward to, I went to Amherst College, and I worked with a novelist there named Robert Stone. He was a pretty well-known novelist, won a National Book Award. He's sort of the real deal. I sold books for a few years after college, and I sort of always thought I'd be a writer, but I didn't really feel I had anything to write about yet. Plus, Wendy and I just had a child, or someone needed money, which is not something you make writing, unless you go into sort of advertising, marketing, or journalism. Pretty much, that's how people get paid to write, unless they have a best-selling book. I might be missing one, but those are sort of the things. So I started doing freelance copywriting, and through a whole series of affairs over about 10 or 15 years, I ended up owning an ad agency in Keene called Church and Main. And, you know, when you're a regional ad agency like that, you do banks, you do insurance companies, you do healthcare, you do computers. And the good thing about it is that for over 20 years I was writing every day. And I was writing about stuff. I wrote about ball bearings. I wrote about sluice gates, which go up and down dams. I wrote about the nozzles that coat M&Ms. I also wrote about healthcare, and I wrote about banking. I wrote annual reports. So that's the good part of it. If you're, once you have something of your own you want to say, it's good to have practice until you get there. And I ended up working at that business to about 2005. But around 2001, I started writing the books I wanted to write. I sold the ad agency, but kept working there for a while. And the first book I wrote is called The Secret Life of Carrots. And it's an autobiography written by the god of carrots. I wrote it, and at the time I was working with Joey Morgan, who most of you know, Al's daughter, who did these amazing illustrations. And we've updated them since then. This is a proposal for the book. And I got an agent for that in around 2003, and he submitted it. And everyone liked it and had no idea what to do with it, which is something that I understood, because I didn't know what to do with it anymore. So that I sort of put on the shelf, and I started writing a series of books that I wanted to write for a long time, in which historical characters come into my everyday life. So I wrote a lot of them, and I kept writing it. Then I did, as I say, what every writer in my generation has to do, which you drive across the country in a VW van and you have a nervous breakdown, because it's like, that's what you do. Right? You know, you have to check all the boxes off. So it's hard to keep track of the schedule. I was still writing a historical book, and I was writing 2 blogs, one about psychology and one I call Writing Asides, which is all the things writers do when they're not writing, which is drinking coffee, staring out windows, taking naps, looking for the perfect... the best one is about man bags, of all things, because if you're a woman, you spend, as far as I can tell, half your life looking for the right purse. If you're a guy who writes, you spend half your life trying to remember where you put your digital tape recorder, your cell phone, your keys, your glasses, your pad, your pen. So I tried using a man bag. It didn't work, but that's the kind of thing I wrote those essays about. And it didn't work when our daughter looked at me, and she sort of blinked when she saw me. I said, okay, I know it doesn't work. Anyway, so I was doing all this writing. In the meantime, I think you know Wendy, my wife, and she was working at the library in Rockingham, Bellows Falls. And she got this letter. You know, you're always getting letters at a library from people like us who want to sell their books. And this small company in Boston that specialized in nature, ecology, and spiritual books not only wanted to sell their books, but they were sort of looking for manuscripts. So I sort of ignored it the first time. And the second time I had this book, which as you can tell from the cover is one of the most profound spiritual books that's ever been written, because it was written by a vegetable. And so I sort of sent it off to them and they loved it, which surprised me because they're very serious. They were, you know, kids, I call them, meaning they were 30. And they did beautiful covers, and it's called print on demand, which means they were doing 500 copies at a time. But I decided, let's try it. Well, in the meantime, I had started working also with Dee Dee Cummings, who a lot of you know. And so we sort of worked on designing the book, more illustrations from Joey, and I kept on saying, well, this small publishing house would be like my Trojan horse. They do black and white books, and meanwhile, I got this. They do 500 at a time. They don't really do marketing, they kind of do. I came from a marketing background. So by the time I sent them the marketing plan, had cut the 70,000 word book to 40,000, gotten more illustrations from Joey, put the whole thing together and said I'd help back the printing. To their credit, they said, well, this is a little above what we had in mind. So at that point, I had another unpublished book, and meanwhile, Dee Dee had arranged for me to speak at the literary festival, reading from this about-to-be-published book called The Carrot, which was no longer being published, and being introduced by Ken Burns, except for the fact that he's eaten a few vegetables, isn't really his specialty. So, but they had this all together, and they were very into it. And at some point, I think in July, I said, you know, it sort of doesn't make sense to have Ken introducing me to read a book about a carrot that's not going to be published. You know, I was about to become the first, I think, unpublished writer to read a book, which I took sort of as a, you know, I was sort of proud of it. Anyway, I said, look, I've been working for 10 years on a book in which historical characters come into my life, and Ken, obviously, is one of the country's foremost historians. And so I said, why don't you just have us, we'll pull it off. We've been talking for 40 years, surely we can do it for half an hour. We'd never done it in public. We were both a little worried because we'd always done it privately, so we were sort of outing ourselves. Shortly after that, I said, why don't we do the book you see up there? He's always wanted to call his, I was going to write his autobiography. I was going to ghostwrite his autobiography called Waking the Dead. And my book I'd always called Real Time, so we put together a little limited edition of it, which is nice. Meanwhile, which we brought out for the literary festival. And meanwhile, Dee Dee, two things happened. Dee Dee got me an agent in California, and she sold the book on depression. So now I had a limited edition version of a book that had never been published. I had a blog that was about to become a book that I hadn't written. I had other books I haven't mentioned that I have manuscripts for. And that's sort of where I stand. I hope I haven't gone over 10 minutes. I have a book called David's Inferno. It's going to be published by a company called Hadley Press next spring. And it's nice because they're distributed by Random House, which is great. I have this agent in California who's just convinced the Carrot book's going to happen. She's a very good agent. She is the agent for Anna Dudeny, who writes the Llama Llama books around here. She's a very good agent. Dee Dee, I have a book I started writing that I love, and I think I'm the only one that loves it. It's called Field Guide to Prescription Drugs. Because while writing the book about depression, there are a lot of books that list all these side effects. There's a lot of books that tell you what you can and can't do, and they don't tell us why. And so I started studying why, and you find out that, like, well, half of the reason is because there are things called receptors. No one ever told me about receptors. So I love this book. It's done in a sort of Hunter Thompson-esque style. So again, on top of all this, I'm interested in a book that no one else is interested in. Plus, I have another book that I really like called The Power of Not Now, which is sort of the future of spirituality. So I was thinking, and then I'll stop. I was thinking that all the people here have something that they really care about, and it's great. They really care about, so they have to figure out how to write. I'm sort of the other side. I love to write. I really care about writing. I have to find things I'm interested in. And I keep finding them, and that's my problem.